Hello and welcome to the Strange Tales podcast, presented by me, your host Winston R. Douglas. This week we will look into the history and many attempts of escape from one of the most legendary prison of all time, the Rock, Alcatraz. Many tried and failed, but we will concentrate on two breakouts, one the Battle of Alcatraz, and the other 15 months in the making. In 1962, inmates Clarence Anglin, John Anglin, and Frank Morris, convicted bank robbers, tucked papier-mâché heads resembling their own likenesses into their beds, broke out of the main prison building via an unused utility corridor, and departed the island aboard an improvised inflatable raft to an uncertain fate. A fourth conspirator, Alan West, failed in his escape attempt and remained on the island. Okay, let's get into today's strange tale. The earliest recorded private owner of the island of Alcatraz is Julian Workman, to whom it was given by Mexican Governor Pío Pico in June 1846, with the understanding that Workman would build a lighthouse on it. Julian Workman is the co-owner of Rancho La Puente and a personal friend of Pío Pico. Later in 1846, acting in his capacity as military governor of California, John C. Fremont bought the island for $5,000 in the name of the United States government from Francis Temple. In 1850, President Millard Fillmore ordered that Alcatraz Island be set aside specifically as a United States military reservation, for military purposes based upon the U.S. acquisition of California from Mexico following the Mexican-American War. Fremont had expected a large compensation for his initiative in purchasing and securing Alcatraz Island for the U.S. government, but the U.S. government later invalidated the sale and paid Fremont nothing. Fremont and his heirs sued for compensation during protracted but unsuccessful legal battles that extended into the 1890s. Following the acquisition of California by the United States as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo in 1848, which ended the Mexican-American War, and the onset of the California Gold Rush the following year, the U.S. Army began studying the suitability of Alcatraz Island for the positioning of coastal batteries to protect the approaches to San Francisco Bay. In 1853, under the direction of Zealous B. Tower, the United States Army Corps of Engineers began fortifying the island, work which continued until 1858, when the initial version of Fort Alcatraz was complete. The island's first garrison, numbering about 200 soldiers, arrived at the end of that year. When the American Civil War broke out in 1861, the island mounted 85 cannons, increased to 105 cannons by 1866 in casemates around its perimeter, though the small size of the garrison meant only a fraction of the guns could be used at one time. At this time it also served as the San Francisco arsenal for storage of firearms to prevent them falling into the hands of Confederate sympathizers. Alcatraz, built as a heavily fortified military site on the west coast, was to form a triangle of defense with Fort Point and Lime Point, but the contemplated work on Lime Point was never built. The first operational lighthouse on the west coast of the United States was also built on Alcatraz. During the war, Fort Alcatraz was used to imprison Confederate sympathizers and privateers on the west coast, but its guns were never fired at an enemy. Because of the isolation created by the cold, strong, tremendous currents of the waters of San Francisco Bay, Alcatraz was used to house soldiers convicted of crimes as early as 1859. By 1861, the fort was the military prison for the Department of the Pacific. It housed Civil War prisoners of war as early as that year. During the Civil War era, rapid changes in artillery and fortification were generated. Alcatraz's defenses were obsolete by the post-war years. Modernization efforts, including an ambitious plan to level the entire island and construct shell-proof underground magazines and tunnels, were undertaken between 1870 and 1876 but never completed. Instead, the Army switched the focus of its plans for Alcatraz from coastal defense to detention, a task for which it was well suited because of its isolation. In 1867, a brick jailhouse was built. Previously inmates had been kept in the basement of the guardhouse, and in 1868, Alcatraz was officially designated as a long-term detention facility for military prisoners. The facility was later discontinued for POWs in 1946. Among those incarcerated at Alcatraz were Confederates caught on the West Coast, and some Hopi Native American men in the 1870s, who refused orders to send their children away from their families to Indian boarding schools. In 1898, due to the Spanish-American War, the prison population rose from 26 to over 450. From 1905 to 1907 it was commanded by U.S. Army General George W. McIver. After the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, civilian prisoners were transferred to Alcatraz for safe confinement. On March 21, 1907, Alcatraz was officially designated as the Western U.S. Military Prison, later Pacific Branch, U.S. Disciplinary Barracks, in 1915. In 1909 construction began on the huge concrete main cell block, designed by Major Reuben Turner, which remains the island's dominant feature. It was completed in 1912. To accommodate the new cell block, the Citadel, a three-story barracks, was demolished down to the first floor, which was below ground level. The building had been constructed in an excavated pit, creating a defensive dry moat. The first floor was incorporated as a basement to the new cell block, giving rise to the popular legend of dungeons below the main cell block. The U.S. Disciplinary Barracks was deactivated in October 1933, and transferred to the Bureau of Prisons. Alcatraz was intended for prisoners who continuously caused trouble at other federal prisons. It would be a last resort prison, to hold the worst of the worst who had no hope of rehabilitation, including Al Capone, Bernard Coy, Sam Shockley, Robert Stroud, George Machine Gun Kelly and Bumpy Johnson. On the 11th of August 1934, the first batch of 137 prisoners arrived from the United States Penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas, having traveled by rail to Santa Venetia, California. Before being escorted to Alcatraz, they were handcuffed in high-security coaches and guarded by some 60 federal FBI special agents, U.S. Marshals, and railway security officials. Most of the prisoners were notorious bank robbers, counterfeiters, or murderers. Among the first inmates were also 14 men from McNeil Island, Washington. On the 22nd of August 1934, 43 prisoners arrived from Atlanta Penitentiary and 10 from Northeastern Penitentiary, Lewisburg, Pennsylvania. On the 1st of September, 1 prisoner arrived from Washington Asylum and Jail and 7 from the District of Columbia Reformatory in Virginia, and on the 4th of September, another batch of 103 prisoners arrived by train from Leavenworth. Prisoners continued to arrive, mainly from Leavenworth and Atlanta, into 1935, and by the 30th of June 1935, the penitentiary's first anniversary, it had a population of 242 prisoners, although some inmates such as Verrill Rapp had already been transferred from Alcatraz some months earlier. On the 10th of January 1935, a severe storm caused a landslide on Alcatraz, causing the Model Industries building to slide. This prompted a series of changes to the structures on the island. A riprap was built around the Model Industries building, it was strengthened, and a guard tower added to the roof in June 1936. That same month, the barracks building was remodeled into 11 new apartments and 9 single rooms for bachelors. By this time there were 52 families living on Alcatraz, including 126 women and children. The problems with the Model Industries building and continuing utility problems with some of the old buildings and systems led to extensive updates in 1937, including new tool-proof grills on the ventilators of the cellhouse roof, 2 new boilers installed in the powerhouse, and a new pump for saltwater sanitation and guardrails added to stairways. In 1939, a $1.1 million redevelopment was begun, including construction of the new Industries building, a complete overhaul of the powerhouse with a new diesel engine, the building of a new water tower to solve the water storage problem, new apartment blocks for officers, improvements to the dock, and the conversion of D block into isolation cells. The changes were completed in July 1941. The workshops of the new industries building became highly productive, making army uniforms, cargo nets, and other items in high demand during World War II. In June 1945, it was reported that the federal penitentiaries had made 60,000 nets. Alcatraz gained notoriety from its inception as the toughest prison in America, considered by many the world's most fearsome prison of the day. Former prisoners reported brutality and inhumane conditions which severely tested their sanity. Ed Woot was the first prisoner to commit suicide in Alcatraz. Roof Pasfall chopped off his fingers after grabbing an axe from the fire truck, begging another inmate to do the same to his other hand. One writer described Alcatraz as the great garbage can of San Francisco Bay, into which every federal prison dumped its most rotten apples. In 1939, the new U.S. Attorney General, Frank Murphy, attacked the penitentiary, saying, "The whole institution is conducive to psychology that builds up a sinister, ambitious attitude among prisoners." The prison's reputation was not helped by the arrival of more of America's most dangerous felons, including Robert Stroud, the Birdman of Alcatraz, in 1942. He entered the prison system at age 19, and never left, spending 17 years at Alcatraz. Stroud killed a guard, tangled with other inmates, and spent 42 of his 54 years in prison in solitary confinement. Despite its reputation, with many former inmates calling it Alcatraz, some prisoners reported that the living conditions there were much better than most other prisons in the country, especially the food, and many volunteered to come to Alcatraz. On the 3rd of December 1940, Henri Young murdered fellow inmate Rufus McCain. Running downstairs from the furniture shop to the tailor's shop where McCain worked, Young violently stabbed McCain in the neck. McCain died 5 hours later. Young had been sent to Alcatraz for murder in 1933, and was later involved in an escape attempt during which gangster Doc Parker was shot to death. He spent nearly 22 months in solitary confinement as a result, but was eventually permitted to work in the furniture shop. Young went to trial in 1941, with his attorneys claiming that their client could not be held responsible for the murder, since he had allegedly been subjected to cruel and unusual punishment by prison guards prior to the act. The trial brought Alcatraz into further disrepute. Ultimately, Young was convicted of manslaughter, and his prison sentence was only extended by a few years. The prison initially had a staff of 155, including the first warden James A. Johnston and associate warden Cecil J. Shuttleworth, both considered to be iron men. None of the staff were trained in rehabilitation but were highly trained in security. The guards and staff's salaries varied. A new guard arriving in December 1948 was offered $3,024 per year, but there was a 6% deduction for retirement taxes a year. The guards typically worked 40-hour weeks with 5 8-hour shifts. The main administration center was at the entrance to the prison, which included the warden's office. The office contained a desk with radio and telegraph equipment, typewriter, and a telephone. The administrative office section also had the offices of the associate warden and secretary, mail desk, captain's desk, a business office, a clerk's office, an accounting office, a control room which was added with modern technology in 1961, the officer's lounge, armory and vault, and a visiting area and restrooms. The basement of Alcatraz prison contained dungeons and the showers. The main stairway to the dungeon lay along Sunrise Alley at the side of A block, but the dungeons were also accessible by a staircase in a trapdoor along the corridor of D block. All visits to Alcatraz required prior written approval from the warden. A hospital had originally been installed at Alcatraz during its time as a military prison in the late 19th century. During its time as a federal penitentiary, it was located above the dining hall on the second floor. Hospital staff were U.S. Public Health Service employees assigned to the Federal Prison Service at Alcatraz. Doctors often lasted fewer than several days or months at Alcatraz, because few of them could tolerate the violent inmates who would often terrify them if they failed to be given certain drugs. Prisoners in ill health were often kept in the hospital, most famously Stroud and Al Capone, who spent years in it. When the Bureau of Prisons established the federal penitentiary on the 1st of January 1934, they took measures to strengthen the security of the prison cells to make Alcatraz escape-proof, and also to improve living conditions for their own staff. Up to date. Technologies for enhancing security and comfort were added to the buildings. Guard towers were built outside at 4 strategic locations. Cells were rebuilt and fitted with tool-proof steel cell fronts and locking devices operated from control boxes, and windows were made covered with iron grills. Electromagnetic metal detectors were placed at the entrances of the dining hall and workshops, with remote-controlled tear gas canisters at appropriate locations. Remote-controlled gun galleries with machine gun-armed guards were installed to patrol along the corridors. Improvements were made to the toilet and electricity facilities. Old tunnels were sealed up with concrete to avoid hiding and escape by prisoners, and substantial changes and improvements were made to the housing facilities of guards, wardens and captain to live with their families, with quality relative to rank. Warden Johnston, U.S. Attorney General Homer Cummings, and Sanford Bates, first director of the Bureau of Prisons, collaborated very closely to create a legendary prison suited to the times, which resulted in the Alcatraz Island Federal Penitentiary being nicknamed Uncle Sam's Devil's Island. Prisoners were normally counted 13 times daily, and the ratio of prisoners to guards was the lowest of any American prison of the time. The front door was made of solid steel, virtually impossible for any prisoners to escape through. The island had many guard towers, most of which have since been demolished, which were heavily guarded at various points in the day at times when security may have been breached. For instance, there were guard towers on each of the industry buildings to ensure that inmates didn't attempt to escape during the workday shifts. The recreation yard and other parts of the prison had a 25-foot fence around it topped with barbed wire, should any inmates attempt to escape during exercise. One former employee of the jail likened his prison job to being a zookeeper or his old farm job, due to the fact that prisoners were treated like animals, sending them out to plow the fields when some of them worked during the day, and then counting them up and feeding them and so on. He referred to those 4 years of his life working in the prison as a total waste of his life. The corridors were regularly patrolled by the guards, with passing gates along them. The most heavily trafficked corridor was Broadway between B and C Block, due to its being the central corridor of the prison and passed not only by guards but other prison workers. At the end of each 20-minute meal in the dining hall, the forks, spoons and knives were laid out on the table and carefully counted to ensure that nothing had been taken as a potential weapon. In the earlier years as a prison, prisoners were forbidden from talking while eating, but this was later relaxed, provided that the prisoners communicated quietly. The gun gallery was situated in the recreation yard and mounted on one of the dining hall's exterior walls. There was a metal detector outside of the dining hall for security purposes. The dining hall had tear gas canisters attached to the rafters of the ceiling which could be activated by remote control, should prisoners riot or attempt to escape. The first warden, James A. Johnston, always entered the dining hall alone and unarmed, due to heavy guarding around him. Several riots did break out in the dining hall during Alcatraz's history. Those prisoners who were not involved in the fighting hid under the dining hall tables to escape possible gunfire. An inmate register reveals that there were 1,576 prisoners in total held at Alcatraz during its time as a federal penitentiary, although figures reported have varied and some have stated 1,557. The prison cells, purposefully designed so that none adjoined an outside wall, typically measured 9 feet or 2.7 meters, by 5 feet or 1.5 meters and 7 feet or 2.1 meters high. The cells were primitive with a bed, a desk and a wash basin and toilet on the back wall and few furnishings except a blanket. An air vent, measuring 6 inches or 150 millimeters by 9 inches or 230 millimeters, covered by a metal grill, lay at the back of the cells which led into the utility corridors. Prisoners had no privacy in going to the toilet, and the toilets would emit a strong stench because they were flushed with salt water. Hot water faucets were not installed until the early 1960s, shortly before closure. The penitentiary established a very strict regimen of rules and regulations under the title, "The Rules and Regulations for the Government and Discipline of the United States Penal and Correctional Institutions," and also a daily routine of work and counts to be followed by the prisoners and also the guards. Copies of these were provided to the prisoners to read and follow. Inmates were basically entitled to food, clothing, shelter, and medical attention. Anything else was seen as a privilege. Inmates were given a blue shirt, grey pants, blue and white in later years, cotton long underwear, socks and a blue handkerchief. The wearing of caps was forbidden in the cell house. Cells were expected to be kept tidy and in good order. Any dangerous article found in the cells or on inmates, such as money, narcotics, intoxicating substances or tools which had the potential to inflict injury or assist in an escape attempt, was considered contraband and made the prisoners eligible for disciplinary action. It was compulsory for prisoners to shave in their cells 3 times a week. Attempting to bribe, intimidate, or assault prison officers was seen as a very serious offense. African Americans were segregated from the rest in cell designation due to racial abuse being prevalent. Toilet paper, matches, soap, and cleanser were issued to the cells on Tuesdays and Saturdays, and inmates could request hot water and a mop to clean their cells. The bars, windows and floors of the prison were cleaned on a daily basis. In earlier years there was a strict code of silence, but by the 1950s this had relaxed, and talking was permitted in the cell house and dining hall provided conversations were quiet and there was no shouting, loud talking, whistling or singing. Prisoners would be woken at 6:30, and sent to breakfast at 6:55. After returning to the cell, inmates then had to tidy their cell and place the waste basket outside. At 7:30 a.m., work started in the shifts for those privileged enough to do so, punctuated by a whistle, and prisoners would have to go through a metal detector during work shifts. If assigned a job, prisoners had to accept that line of work. Prisoners were not permitted to have money in their possessions, but earnings went into a prisoner's trust fund. Some of the prisoners were assigned duties with the guards and foremen in the laundry, tailor shop, cobbler's shop, model shop, etc., and in gardening and labor. Smoking, a privilege, was permitted in the workplace providing there wasn't any hazardous condition, but inmates were not permitted to smoke between the recreation yard and work. Lunch was served at 11:20, followed by a 30-minute rest in the cell, before returning to work until 16:15. Dinner was served at 16:25 and the prisoners would then retire to their cells to be locked in for the night at 16:50. Lights went off at 21:30. After being locked in for the night, 6 guards usually patrolled the 4 cell blocks. Many prisoners have compared their duration at Alcatraz to hell and would have preferred death to continued incarceration. Alcatraz Library was located at the end of D Block. Upon entering Alcatraz, every inmate was given a library card and a catalogue of books found in the library. Inmates could place orders by putting a slip with their card in a box at the entrance to the dining hall before breakfast, and the books would be delivered to and from their cell by a librarian. The library, which utilized a closed stack paging system, had a collection of 10,000 to 15,000 books, mainly left over from the army days. Inmates were permitted a maximum of 3 books in addition to up 12 textbooks, a Bible, and a dictionary. They were permitted to subscribe to magazines, but crime-related pages were torn out and newspapers were prohibited. Sex, crime and violence was censored from all books and magazines, and the library was governed by a chaplain who regulated the censorship and the nature of the reading material to ensure that the material was wholesome. Failure to return books by the date given made the inmate liable to removal of privileges. The average prisoner reads 75 to 100 books a year. Every evening, inmates would generally read books loaned from the library, and usually an hour or 75 minutes was allocated to the practicing of musical instruments, from the guitar to the accordion. A prison band often practiced in the dining room or auditorium above it. Al Capone famously practiced the banjo in the shower block, although most prisoners were limited to playing in their cells alone. Alcatraz Dining Hall, often referred to as the mess hall, is the dining hall where the prisoners and staff ate their meals. It is a long wing on the west end of the main cell house of Alcatraz, situated in the center of the island. It is connected to the block by a corridor known as Times Square, as it passes beneath a large clock approaching the entranceway to the dining hall. This wing includes the dining hall and the kitchen beyond it. On the second floor was the hospital and the auditorium, which was where movies were screened to the inmates at weekends. April 27, 1936. The first attempt to escape the prison was made by Joseph Bowers, who was assigned the duty of burning trash at the incinerator. He was working burning garbage at the island's incinerator during duty hours when he suddenly ran and began scaling a chain-link fence at the edge of the island in an apparent attempt to make for the shore. When he was caught in this act and refused orders of the correctional officer located at the West Road Guard Tower to come down, he was shot. He was seriously injured in the fall from over 50 feet or 15 meters, and consequently died. The incident, termed Bowers' desperate escape, was variously deemed by inmates to have been an actual escape attempt, a deliberate suicide. December 16, 1937. Theodore Cole and Ralph Rowe had gradually filed through iron bars in the prison's match shop in the Industries building and escaped on a very foggy day, preventing them from being spotted by guards in the watchtowers. The two jumped into the water and were never seen again, but the severe weather conditions at the time have led to a consensus that they drowned in the bay and their bodies were swept out to sea by the strong current in San Francisco Bay. However, they were listed as number 1 and number 2 on the FBI Most Wanted list. May 23, 1938. Rufus Franklin, Thomas R. Limerick, and James C. Lucas attacked and killed a guard with a claw hammer in the woodwork shop in the Industries building, and then proceeded to the roof, where an armed guard shot Franklin and Limerick. Other guards arrived at the scene. Lucas was cornered and surrendered to the guards. The officer Klein died of his injuries the next day. Thomas Limerick also died. January 13, 1939. Arthur Doc Barker, William Martin, Rufus McCain, Henri Young, and Dale Stamphill were inmates of the prison's supposedly most secure unit, D Block, when they managed to escape the cell house and reach the Alcatraz shore on the night of Friday 13, 1939. As they were putting a makeshift raft together, they were spotted and fired on by a guard in a watchtower. Barker was killed, Stamphill was wounded, and the others were sent to solitary confinement. May 21, 1941. Joe Kretzer, Sam Shockley, Arnold Kyle, and Lloyd Barkdoll were working in the Industries area when they jumped the guards on duty and attempted to saw through window bars to reach the shore. The tool-proof bars foiled the attempt, and they were surrendered when this became apparent. Both Kretzer and Shockley would try to escape again in the Battle of Alcatraz. September 15, 1941. John Richard Bayless was working on the garbage detail and managed to elude the guards and reach the Alcatraz shore. He jumped into the water and tried swimming to San Francisco, but quickly gave up the attempt. April 14, 1943. James Borman, Harold Martin Brest, Floyd Garland Hamilton, and Fred John Hunter, managed to cut window bars in the industry's building's match shop without being noticed and assemble 4 cans that contained army uniforms and could serve as flotation devices. They then overpowered 2 guards and bound and gagged them, then escaped out the window, leaving behind 2 of the 4 cans. One of the overpowered guards managed to get his whistle loose and the other managed to slip his gag and blow the first guard's whistle, alerting the tower guards who opened fire on the prisoners. August 7, 1943. Huron Ted Walters, who was serving a sentence of 30 years for robbery, assault, and auto theft, noticed that on weekends, fewer guards were on duty, and their attention tended to be focused on the recreation yard. On Saturday, August 7th, he took advantage of the situation to slip out of the new industries building, where he was working in the laundry. His plan was to cut through the 2 security fences that separated him from freedom, make his way to the water, and swim the 1.4 miles to San Francisco. His plan went sideways early. The contraband wire cutters failed him, so he had to climb both fences, which cost him valuable time. Then, he fell from the second fence onto the rocks and injured his back. Although he made it to the island's shoreline, he could go no farther, and was picked up by Captain of the Guards Henry Weinholt and Associate Warden E.J. Miller. He was returned to the cell house, where he spent some time in the prison hospital, then in solitary. July 23, 1956. Floyd Wilson disappeared from his job at the dock but was discovered after hiding for 12 hours among large rocks along the shoreline after giving up on his plan to make a raft out of driftwood. Hello and welcome to the Strange Tales 1946 presented by me, your host Winston Douglas. The escape attempt was planned by Bernard Coy. This week we will look into the history convicts were and many attempts in the main escape plan from one of the most legendary prisons of all time, Joseph Kretzer and Clarence Carnes. Many tried and failed, but we will concentrate on 2 breakouts after the Battle of Alcatraz, and the other 15 months in the making. In 1962, inmates Clarence Anglin, John Anglin, and Frank Morris convicted bank robbers, the west end of the cell house was protected resembling their own likenesses into their beds, broke out of the main prison building via an unused utility corridor, and departed the island aboard an improvised inflatable raft to an uncertain main cell block. And when the gallery conspirator, Alan West, failed in his escape attempt and remained on the island. While most convicts and corrections officers were in outside workshops, the earliest recorded private owner of the island of Alcatraz is Julian Workman, to whom it was given by Mexican Governor P.O. officer William Miller to let him in as he had with the understanding that Workman would build a lighthouse on it. As Miller was frisking Hubbard for any stolen of Rancho La Puente from behind, and the 2 men overpowered the officer. Later in 1846, they then released, acting in his capacity as military governor of California, John C. Fremont. The cell house had an elevated gun gallery that was regularly patrolled by an armed officer. The officer, Bert Birch, had a set routine, and the convicts had attacked Miller while Birch was away. Coy, as a cell house orderly, had over the years spotted a flaw in the bars protecting the gun gallery, which allowed them to be widened using a bar-spreading device consisting of a nut and bolt with pliant metal sleeve that moved when the nut was turned by a small wrench. Coy thus managed to spread the bars and squeeze through the widened gap. Coy starved himself in order to fit through the space between the widened bars, which was still relatively narrow, into the temporarily vacant gallery and to overpower and bind Birch on his return. Coy kept the Springfield rifle in the gallery and lowered a pistol, keys, a number of clubs, and gas grenades to his accomplices below. Continuing along the gun gallery, Coy then entered D Block, which was separated from the main cell house by a concrete wall and was used for prisoners kept in isolation. There, he used the rifle to force Officer Cecil Corwin to open the door to the main cell house and let the others in. They then released about a dozen convicts including Sam Shockley and Myron Thompson. Shockley and Thompson joined Coy, Carnes, Hubbard, and Kretzer in the main cell house. The other prisoners returned to their cells. Miller and Corwin were placed in a cell in C Block. The escapees now needed to secure the key to the yard door of the prison from which they expected to make their way to the island's dock to seize the prison's launch. The boat docked daily between 1410 and 1430. The plan was to use the hostage officers as cover as the prisoners made their way to the dock, then San Francisco and freedom. Miller had held on to the yard door key, against regulations, so that he could let out kitchen staff without having to disturb the gallery officer at lunch. Although they eventually found the key by searching the captive officers and the cell in which the prisoners had placed them, the door would not open because the lock had jammed as the prisoners had tried several other keys while searching for the correct one. The escape attempt was thus inadvertently foiled from the outset as the prisoners were trapped in the cell house. Meanwhile, additional officers who entered the cell house as part of their routine were seized along with others sent to investigate when the former officer failed to report in. The prisoners were soon holding 9 officers in 2 separate cells, but with nowhere to go, despair set in among the would-be escapees. Having failed on their initial plan, the prisoners decided to shoot it out. At 14:35 Coy took the rifle and fired at the officers in some neighboring watchtowers, wounding one of them. Associate Warden Ed Miller went to the cell house to investigate, armed with a gas billy club. He came across Coy, who shot at him. Miller retreated. By now, the alarm had been raised. Their plan having failed, Shockley and Thompson urged Kretzer, who had one of the guns, to kill the hostages in case they testified against them. Kretzer opened fire on the officers, wounding 5, and 3 seriously, including Bill Miller, who later died of his wounds. Carnes, Shockley, and Thompson then returned to their cells, but Coy, Hubbard, and Kretzer decided they were not going to surrender. Meanwhile, one of the hostages discreetly wrote down the names of the convicts involved, circling the names of the ringleaders. At about 1800 hours, a squad of armed officers entering the gun cage were shot at by the convicts. One officer, Harold Stites, was killed by friendly fire, and 4 other officers were wounded. Prison officials then cut the electricity and put on hold all further attempts to regain control of the cell house until darkness. Warden James A. Johnston asked for federal troops from nearby Naval Station Treasure Island to help deal with the situation. 2 platoons of Marines under the direction of Generals Vinegar Joe Stilwell and Frank Merrill were dispatched to the island to guard the general population of convicts and take the cell house from the outside. After night fell, 2 squads of officers entered the prison to locate and rescue the captive officers. There was a long-standing rule at Alcatraz that no guns were allowed in the cell house, and the prison officials did not want more officers injured or killed. The convicts' position on the top of a cell block provided a nearly impregnable firing position as they were out of range of the officers in the gun cages. At 2000 hours, unarmed officers entered the cell house, covered by armed officers in the 2 gun galleries overhead. They found the hostages, however. One officer was wounded by a gunshot fired from the roof of one of the cell blocks. They locked the open door to D-block. When the last officer reached safety, the officers opened a massive barrage from machine guns, mortars, and grenades on the prisoners within D-block, where the prison authorities erroneously thought one of the armed convicts was holed up. They eventually figured out that the rebellious prisoners were confined to the main cell house and ceased their attack until further tactics were worked out. The Marines, led by World War II veteran, Warrant Officer Charles Lafayette Buckner, implemented a plan to drive the armed convicts into a corner with tactics they had perfected against entrenched Japanese resistance during the Pacific War. They drilled holes in the prison roof and dropped grenades into areas where they believed the convicts were located, to force them into a utility corridor where they could be cornered. On May 3, at about 12 o'clock, the convicts phoned Johnston to try to discuss a deal. Johnston would only accept their surrender. Kretzer replied that he'd never be taken alive. Later that day, A shot was fired at an officer as he checked out C Block's utility corridor. That night, a constant fusillade was fired at the cell block until about 2100 hours. The following morning, squads of armed officers periodically rushed into the cell house, firing repeatedly into the narrow corridor. At 9:40 on May 4th, they finally entered the corridor and found the bodies of Kretzer, Coy, and Hubbard. Before the escape attempt, Hubbard had petitioned for a writ of habeas corpus on the grounds that his confession had been beaten out of him. He had produced hospital records to back up his claims. A federal hearing into the matter had been scheduled for the Monday after he died. The case was dismissed on a motion filed by prosecutor Joseph Koresh, who is quoted as saying that had it gone through, Hubbard would have had a fair chance of being released. Myron Thompson and Sam Shockley were executed simultaneously in the gas chamber at San Quentin on December 3, 1948, for their roles in the Battle of Alcatraz. Carnes was given an additional life sentence, but was eventually released from prison in 1973. However, he breached his parole conditions, was sent back to prison and died there from complications from AIDS in 1988. Increased security measures ensured that there were no more escape attempts until 1956. September 29, 1958. Aaron Burgett and Clyde Johnson were working on the garbage detail when they overpowered a guard. Both jumped into the water, trying to swim off the island. The two men attempted to use inflated plastic bags as flotation devices, and Burger tied wooden boards to his feet to serve as swim fins. A police launch intercepted Johnson, but Burgett disappeared. He perished in the attempt, and his body was found floating in the bay near Alcatraz, 2 weeks later. June 11, 1962. Frank Lee Morris, Alan West with the Anglin brothers, John William and Clarence, knew each other from previous incarcerations in Florida and Georgia. When they were assigned adjacent cells in December 1961, they began formulating an escape plan 15 months in the making under the leadership of Morris, who had an IQ of 133. They widened the ventilation ducts beneath their sinks using discarded saw blades found on the prison grounds and metal spoons from the mess hall. They took turns, one man on lookout and the other at work breaking down the concrete that had been dilapidated by the salt air. The men concealed their work with painted cardboard, and the noise with Morris's accordion on top of the ambient din of music hour. Once the holes were wide enough to pass through, the men accessed the unguarded utility corridor directly behind their cell's tier and climbed to the vacant top level of the cell block, where they set up a clandestine workshop. Here, using over 50 raincoats among other stolen and donated materials, they constructed life preservers, based on a design one of them found in Popular Mechanics magazine. They also assembled a 6x14-foot rubber raft, the seams carefully stitched by hand and sealed with heat from nearby steam pipes. Paddles were improvised from scrap wood and screws. Finally, they climbed a ventilation shaft to the roof. The men concealed their absence while working outside their cells. And after the escape itself by sculpting dummy heads from a homemade papier-mâché-like mixture of soap, toothpaste, concrete dust, and toilet paper, and giving them a realistic appearance with paint from the maintenance shop and hair from the barbershop floor where Clarence worked. With towels and clothing piled under the blankets in their bunks and the dummy heads positioned on the pillows, they appeared to be sleeping. On the night of June 11, 1962, just after lights out with all preparations in place, the men initiated their plan. West had discovered that the cement he had used to reinforce crumbling concrete around his vent had hardened, narrowing the opening and fixing the grill in place. By the time he managed to remove the grill and re-widen the hole, the others had left without him. He returned to his cell and went to sleep. From the service corridor, Morris and the Anglins brothers climbed the ventilation shaft to the roof. Guards heard a loud crash as they broke out of the shaft, but nothing further was heard, and the source of the noise was not investigated, but the inmates in the block started to make lots of noise as a cover. Hauling their gear with them, they descended 50 feet or 15 meters to the ground by sliding down a kitchen vent pipe, then climbed two 12-foot or 3.7 meters barbed wire perimeter fences. At the northeast shoreline, near the power plant, a blind spot in the prison's network of searchlights and gun towers, they inflated their raft with a pump made out of Morris's accordion. At some time after 10 p.m., investigators estimated, they boarded the raft, launched it and departed toward their objective, Angel Island, 2 miles to the north. The escape was not discovered until the morning of June 12 due to the successful dummy head ruse. Multiple military and law enforcement agencies conducted an extensive air, sea, and land search over the next 10 days. On June 14, a Coast Guard cutter picked up a paddle floating about 200 yards or 180 meters off the southern shore of Angel Island. On the same day and in the same general location, workers on another boat found a wallet wrapped in plastic complete with names, addresses, and photos of the Anglins' friends and relatives. On June 21, shreds of raincoat material, believed to be remnants of the raft, were found on a beach not far from the Golden Gate Bridge. The following day, a prison boat picked up a deflated life jacket made from the same material 50 yards or 46 meters off Alcatraz Island. According to the final FBI report, no other physical evidence was found. FBI agents surmised early on that the men had drowned. They cited the fact that the individuals' personal effects were the only belongings they had, and the men would have drowned before leaving them behind. However, no human remains were found at the time. On July 17, a month after the escape, a Norwegian ship, SS Norefjell, spotted a body floating in the ocean 15 nautical miles or 28 kilometers from the Golden Gate Bridge. The ship did not retrieve the body, and did not report the sighting until October. San Francisco County Coroner Henry Turkle cast doubt on speculation that it could have been one of the escapees, emphasizing the improbability that a body would still be floating on the surface of the ocean after more than a month. Instead, Turkle proposed that the corpse may have been that of Cecil Philip Herman, a 34-year-old unemployed baker who had committed suicide by jumping from the Golden Gate Bridge 5 days earlier. Several coroners from neighboring counties challenged Turkle's opinion, stating that it was possible the remains had belonged to one of the escapees. FBI investigators announced their official position that, while it was theoretically possible for the men to have reached Angel Island, the odds of their having survived the turbulent currents and frigid waters of the bay were negligible. According to the final FBI report, West said that they had planned to steal clothes and a car upon reaching land, but no such thefts were reported in the immediate area. West was the only conspirator not to participate in the actual escape. He fully cooperated with the investigation and was therefore not charged for his role. The FBI closed its file on December 31, 1979, after a 17-year investigation. Their official finding was that the prisoners most likely drowned in the cold waters of the bay while attempting to reach Angel Island. They cited the remnants found of the raft as well as the personal effects of the men, as evidence that the raft broke up and sank at some point and the 3 convicts succumbed to hypothermia, their bodies swept out to sea by the rapid currents of the San Francisco Bay. The FBI did hand their evidence over to the U.S. Marshals Service, whose investigation remains open. As Deputy U.S. Marshal Michael Dyke told NPR, "There's an active warrant, and the Marshals Service doesn't give up looking for people." In January 1965, the FBI investigated a rumor that Clarence Anglin was living in Brazil. Agents were dispatched to South America but found no direct evidence that he was there. A man called the Bureau in 1967 claiming to have been Morris's classmate and to have known him for 30 years. He said he had bumped into him in Maryland and described him as having a small beard and mustache, but refused to give further details. Family members of the Anglin brothers occasionally received unsigned postcards and messages over the years. Once a card came signed Jerry and another Jerry and Joe. The family also produced a Christmas card, purportedly received in the family mailbox in 1962, saying, "To Mother, from John. Merry Christmas." Another of the Anglins' 11 siblings, Robert, also said that sometimes the phone would ring and all that could be heard was breathing on the other end. Robert said, "I suppose all that could have been pranks, but maybe it was my brothers." The mother of the Anglin brothers received flowers anonymously every Mother's Day until her death in 1973, and 2 very tall, unusual women in heavy makeup were reported to have attended her funeral. Federal officials say that in the mid to late 1960s and into the 1970s there were 6 or 7 sightings reported of the Anglin brothers, all in North Florida or Georgia. Roberts said that in 1989, when the father of the Anglin brothers died, 2 strangers in beards showed up at the funeral home. According to Robert, they stood in front of the casket looking at the body a few minutes, they wept, then, they walked out. In 1989, a woman who identified herself only as Kathy called Unsolved Mysteries tip line to report that a photo of Clarence Anglin matched the description of a man who lived on a farm near Marianna, Florida. Another woman also recognized a photo of Clarence Anglin and said he lived near Marianna. She correctly identified his eye color, height, and other physical features. Another witness claimed that a sketch of Frank Morris bore a striking resemblance to a man she had seen in the same area. A day after the escape, a man claiming to be John Anglin called a lawyer, Eugenia McGowan, in San Francisco to arrange a meeting with the U.S. Marshal's office. When McGowan refused, the caller terminated the phone call. The FBI dismissed the call as a prank. Robert Checky, a San Francisco police officer, said that at 1 a.m. on the morning of June 12, he saw an illegal boat in the bay near Alcatraz. A few minutes later, the boat left, heading under the Golden Gate Bridge. This led to speculation that the prisoners might have enlisted outside Confederates to pick them up. The FBI dismissed Checky's account out of hand. In 1993, a former Alcatraz inmate named Thomas Kent told the television program America's Most Wanted that he had helped plan the escape, and claimed to have provided significant new leads to investigators. He said that Clarence Anglin's girlfriend had agreed to meet the men on shore and drive them to Mexico. He declined to participate in the actual escape, he said, because he could not swim. Officials were skeptical of Kent's account, because he had been paid $2,000 for the interview. A man named John Leroy Kelly dictated an extended deathbed confession to his nurse in 1993. Kelly claimed that he and a partner picked up Morris and the Anglins in a boat and transported them to the Seattle, Washington area. Later, under the guise of transporting them to Canada, Kelly and his partner murdered the escapees to get the $40,000 their families had collected for them. At a location in Seattle where Kelly claimed the 3 escapees were buried, no human remains were found. A 2003 Mythbusters episode on the Discovery Channel tested the feasibility of an escape from the island aboard a raft constructed with the same materials and tools available to the inmates, and concluded that it was possible. A 2011 documentary on the National Geographic Channel entitled Vanished from Alcatraz reported that contrary to the official FBI report, a raft was discovered on Angel Island on June 12, 1962, the day after the escape. Footprints were allegedly found leading away from the raft. Furthermore, a 1955 blue Chevrolet was reported stolen in Marin County the same day, a claim corroborated by contemporaneous stories in the Humboldt Times and the San Francisco Examiner. The following day, a motorist in Stockton, California, 80 miles or 130 kilometers east of San Francisco, reported to the California Highway Patrol that he had been forced off the road by 3 men in a blue Chevrolet. The same year, an 89-year-old man named Bud Morris, who claimed he was a cousin of Frank Morris, said that on 8 or 9 occasions prior to the escape he delivered envelopes of money to Alcatraz guards, presumably as bribes. He further claimed to have met his cousin face to face in a San Diego park shortly after the escape. His daughter, who was 8 or 9 years old at the time, said she was present at the meeting with Dad's friend, Frank, but had no idea about the escape. A 2014 study of the ocean currents by scientists at Delft University concluded that if the prisoners left Alcatraz at 11:30 p.m. on June 11, they could have made it to Horseshoe Bay, just north of the Golden Gate Bridge, and that any debris would have floated in the direction of Angel Island, consistent with where the paddle and belongings were actually found. If they left before or after that time, they said, tides and currents were such that their chances of survival were slim. A 2015 History Channel documentary entitled Alcatraz, Search for the Truth presented further circumstantial evidence gathered over the years by the Anglin family. Kenneth and David Widner displayed Christmas cards containing the Anglins' handwriting, and allegedly received by family members for 3 years after the escape. While the handwriting was verified as the Anglins', none of the envelopes contained a postmarked stamp, so experts could not determine when they had been delivered. The family cited a story from family friend Fred Britzi, who grew up with the brothers and claimed to have recognized them in Rio de Janeiro in 1975. They produced photographs purportedly taken by Britzi, including one of 2 men, who according to Britzi were John and Clarence Anglin, standing next to a large termite mound. Other photos showed a Brazilian farm that Britzi claimed was owned by the men. Forensic experts working for the family confirmed that the photos were taken in 1975, and asserted that the 2 men were more than likely the Anglins, although the age and condition of the photo, and the fact that both men were wearing sunglasses, hindered efforts to make a definitive determination. Britzi also presented an alternative escape theory. Rather than use the raft to cross the bay, he said, they paddled around the island to the boat dock, where they attached an electrical cord, which was reported missing from the dock on the night of the escape, to the rudder of a prison ferry that departed the island shortly after midnight, and were towed behind it to the mainland. Robert Anglin reportedly told family members before his death in 2010 that he had been in contact with John and Clarence from 1963 until approximately 1987. Surviving family members, who said they have heard nothing since Robert lost contact with the brothers in 1987, announced plans to travel to Brazil to conduct a personal search. But Roderick cautioned that they could be arrested by Brazilian authorities because the Alcatraz escape remains an open Interpol case. In 2018, the FBI confirmed the existence of a letter, allegedly written by John Anglin, and received by the San Francisco Police Department in 2013. The writer asserted that Frank Morris died in 2008 and was buried in Alexandria under a different name, and Clarence Anglin died in 2011. His purpose in writing the letter, he said, was to negotiate his surrender in exchange for medical treatment of his cancer. The letter's authenticity was deemed inconclusive. In a 2019 episode of the series Mission Declassified, investigative journalist Christoph Putzel corroborated much of the information released by the FBI and other sources, including the raft found on Angel Island. He quoted various reports mentioning a blue Chevrolet, of the same description as the one stolen after the escape, spotted in Oklahoma, Indiana, Ohio, and South Carolina, where, 3 months after the escape, 3 men matching the escapee's description attempted to acquire a residence in the woods. December 16, 1962. John Paul Scott and Darl Lee Parker were the last 2 prisoners to attempt to escape from Alcatraz. Scott and Parker used a makeshift saw to cut through the bars on a kitchen window in the cell house, then ran to the edge of the island and jumped into the water. Parker was found alive 81 yards from the main island on the rock formation Little Alcatraz. Scott reached Fort Point beneath the Golden Gate Bridge, where he was found by teenagers, suffering from hypothermia and exhaustion. After recovering in Letterman General Hospital, he was immediately returned to Alcatraz. It is the only proven case of an Alcatraz inmate reaching the shore by swimming. By the 1950s, conditions at Alcatraz had improved, and inmates were gradually permitted more privileges, such as playing musical instruments, watching movies on weekends, painting, and radio use. The strict code of silence became more relaxed, and prisoners were permitted to talk quietly. However, it was by far the most expensive prison in the United States, and many still perceived it as America's most extreme jail. In his annual report for 1952, Bureau of Prisons Director James V. Bennett called for a more centralized institution to replace Alcatraz. A 1959 report indicated that the facility was over 3 times more expensive to run than the average American prison, $10 per prisoner per day compared to $3 in most other prisons. The problem was made worse by the building's structural deterioration from exposure to salt spray, which would require $5 million to fix. Major repairs began in 1958, but by 1961 engineers considered the prison a lost cause. Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy submitted plans for a new maximum security institution at Marion, Illinois. Today a museum and one of San Francisco's major tourist attractions, Alcatraz drew some 1.5 million visitors annually. Visitors arrive by boat and are given a tour of the cell house and island, and a slideshow and audio narration with anecdotes from former inmates, guards and rangers on Alcatraz. The atmosphere of the former penitentiary is still considered to be eerie, ghostly and chilling. Protected by the National Park Service and the National Register of Historic Places, the salt-damaged buildings of the former prison are now being restored and maintained. Thank you all so much for listening. I really hope that you enjoyed today's strange tale. If you did, please smash that gorgeous like button, and subscribe so that you will be notified to future shows. Also, if you could write a 5-star review, that would really help us get the word out, so other people can enjoy the podcast as well. You can follow me on Twitter, Facebook and YouTube at Strange Tales Pod. Or you can message me at strangetalespod@gmail.com with feedback or ideas on future shows. This is your host Winston R. Douglas signing out for now. Thanks again. Hope to see you again soon.